We are going to talk about the Shahed leaks because this was actually a fairly substantial set of information we got about it. And real quick, though, I wanted to get a couple things out of the way first. So, John, first off, how you doing, John?
I'm doing pretty well.
Wonderful to hear, John. So I just wanted to start with just a couple other things we talked a little bit about this week, just to maybe inform the listeners as far as you wanted. So there was a little bit of discussion about the Starlink stuff. So it started, I would say, as rumors on Telegram from both the Ukrainian and the Russian side that basically Russians are sort of using shell companies to buy Starlink terminals, and because the geofencing only works so well. They're basically able to use Starlink pretty effectively at this point in the war. So that started as rumors. It seems more or less that the Ukrainians are basically stating this out right now. And I think a lot of people are maybe under the impression to some extent that like the company itself maybe has more responsibility to crack down on this. So I'm just curious if there's any technical stuff you want to share with people, or I know you follow Starlink and the technology pretty closely, so I wanted you to share your thoughts on that. Go ahead.
So my understanding, just based upon some conversations with some friends, is that SpaceX is aware of the issue. They are trying to resolve it. Unfortunately, due to some rather technical and practical reasons, this is going to be a very difficult problem to approach. There is a minimum size to the cells, more or less, the roughly hexagonal cells that Starlink uses to more or less divvy up the surface of the Earth and determine whether or not service will be provided. Those cells are about 12 kilometers or so wide, which is pretty large on the scale of something like the front line in Ukraine, where you may have opposing Ukrainian and Russian trench lines, 1 to 2 kilometers apart. So, in terms of broad area access to Starlink, the issue is that for those areas for the Starlink's coverage cells that are along the front line, it's impossible to just broadly shut those off without also denying Starlink to Ukrainian users. So that's a problem. The issue on top of that is that, as far as I'm aware, I've talked to Jakub a little, or he posted some public stuff about this, and I've also talked to a couple people privately about it. As far as I'm aware, or any of us are aware, there is no centralized registry of Starlink terminals that are operated by the ZSU or the Ukrainian government more broadly, which poses an issue in that without such a registry, SpaceX can't go in and selectively blacklist terminals that aren't on, say, a whitelisted registry of terminals to provide service to. So that's another layer to the problem. A third layer is the rampant GNSS denial, GPS specifically, by both Russia and Ukraine along the front line. That makes it problematic for for SpaceX to estimate the location of each of the terminals and accurately locate it within one of those coverage cells. Again, that just makes this problem in terms of how do you go about denying the usage of Starlink to the Russians that much more problematic. And then finally, the ad hoc way in which these terminals and subscriptions have been secured in a lot of cases. Well, in Russia's case, they're purchasing the terminals abroad as well as paying for the subscriptions outside of Russia and then taking them into Ukraine. And while the Ukrainian government has been procuring Starlink terminals directly themselves via a number of sources, the Polish government, USA, the DoD, etc., a great many Ukrainian Starlink terminals have been purchased by volunteers, just at electronic stores or online directly from SpaceX. And many volunteers, covered the subscription costs individually for units for a company or platoon, etc. And so the way the service is being provided to Ukraine's completely, the service and the terminals, I should say, are just completely fragmented. So unfortunately, there is no easy technical solution for how to approach this problem, at least in a short span of time.
Yeah, so I think in the short term, it's going to be very difficult. I would maybe say that Starlink as a company maybe has some sort of ethical responsibility to look into it and attempt a solution here, just because, it is a war and there are, lives at stake, and I would say American interests where the Starlink company is located. But I don't know, do you think like medium or long term there is a solution here? It's just going to take some time, or do you think that it's more just that this is maybe something we're going to have to deal with, is that Starlink is going to potentially be used by adversaries in the future? Go ahead, John.
So in the future, I don't have many future concerns about this outside Ukraine because from a normal peacetime procurement standpoint, it's pretty simple for the DoD or any allied or partner forces to just have centralized procurements of the terminals. Just have the DoD say, for example, order 100,000 Starlink terminals. They'll receive them in an organized, centralized way. They can create a centralized registry of terminals that are being operated by them, and then it becomes very easy for Starlink to whitelist those in service denied areas. And then it just becomes just a military issue of making sure you retain custody of those terminals, making sure they aren't lost, captured by the enemy, just like we do with cryptographic gear, other communications equipment as is. So nothing really out of the ordinary. So I wouldn't say it's a issue beyond Ukraine, just because once Starlink gets incorporated into the normal defense procurement cycle, that process in and of itself will mitigate or entirely eliminate most of these concerns. For Ukraine, the problem is going to be somewhat more intractable. The best approach would probably begin an effort to centralize the terminals and begin having units provide all the relevant serial numbers, SIM numbers, and all the other identifying information needed to create a centralized registry of terminals. That would probably be a several month effort, just given the haphazard way in which these have been procured and operated. But that would be a starting point, at least. Try to go about maybe not fixing this entirely, but at least mitigating it.
Great, thanks, John. Any other stuff on Starlink, or we want to move on?
No, that's it.
Cool. So yeah, I think just I know you were mentioning some stuff about missiles this week, but I'll let you talk about anything you want to talk about that.
Right. So in terms of missiles, we got confirmation that GLSDB has been employed in combat. It has not been reported anywhere really. I think the DoD may have made brief reference to it. There is a closed Russian Telegram channel that posted images of a tail fin assembly from a small diameter bomb allegedly recovered somewhere in Crimea. I don't have access to that Telegram channel, but a tiny Twitter account with like 10 people following it posted the images from that account. I don't have a link on hand, but suffice to say, we do now have visual confirmation that small diameter bomb, or ground launched small diameter bomb, I should say, has been deployed by Ukraine. So that's a positive development there. On the Russian side of things, in terms of missile deployments, there was some interesting news in terms of some wreckage that was recovered in Kyiv. There was a large metal assembly that was dug up from the dirt following a raid a couple days ago or late last week. And it looked like there had essentially been like electro-penciled onto the metal assembly a Grau index, I should say, 3M22. For those who are not familiar with Russian missile designations, 3M22 is the Grau index corresponding to Zircon, which is Russia's hypersonic cruise missile system. It's a hypersonic anti-ship cruise missile specifically. Unlike Kinzhal, which is just an air-launched ballistic missile, it's just an air-launched Iskander-M. Despite Russian claims to the contrary, it's not hypersonic. Zircon, on the other hand, if it performs roughly as advertised, it is actually a hypersonic weapon. We don't have public confirmation that wreckage is actually from 3M22. One of the issues being that there are no reference images of Zircon publicly available. We have a small amount of test launch footage, but we've never actually gotten any clear video or images of the vehicle itself. That's just not available publicly, as far as I can tell. I've scoured the English and Russian language internet and Ukrainian language internet, and beyond like renderings and concept art, there's nothing to cross-reference this wreckage with. And what's interesting is that I believe this piece of wreckage was near identical to another set of wreckage that was recovered late last year, I believe on the 30th of December, again following a Russian raid. And that piece of wreckage also had, again, same identical metal subassembly. I can try and actually find an image to put up. That had also had 3M22 electro-penciled onto it. So that may indicate that if this is in fact Zircon, as the wreckage seems to lean towards, this would be an indicator that Russia has deployed it at least twice and has potentially become the first country to operationally employ a hypersonic cruise missile or just a hypersonic weapon in general, which was as it's interesting um, milestone for hypersonics engineering. Unfortunately, potentially made by Russia. So we'll have to see how this goes. If this does end up being Sarkon, I'm not particularly concerned about it having a major impact. I don't suspect Russia has a particularly large stockpile of them, and their manufacturing capacity for them probably isn't very large. Um, in terms of how it was launched, my assumption would be that it was from a vessel of the Black Sea Fleet. We don't know. There hasn't been a public indication that any of the vessels of the Black Sea Fleet have received the necessary upgrades to launch Zircon. In principle, the Admiral Grigorovich class frigates they have the appropriate vertical launching system in terms of the cell is sized to fit Zircon. It's not clear publicly whether or not they received the combat management system upgrades that would be required to actually use the weapon. I suspect they're the most likely candidates, though, of any of the vessels in the Black Sea Fleet. Um, there are also plans to eventually integrate Zircon with the Bastion complex, which Russia is a coastal missile system that Russia has deployed in Crimea. They've been previously using it to launch Onyx supersonic anti-ship missiles. Uh, that was in principle supposed to receive Zircon integration, but that would likely be farther out than just directly integrating on the Grigoroviches, which I suspect what happened. The missiles were likely drawn from either Northern Fleet stock or Pacific Fleet stock, if I had to guess, as they are the only two units that operate the Gorshkov class frigates, which were previously the only Russian surface combatants that are publicly acknowledged to have Zircon integrated.
Great, thanks, John. So I think now we move to our main topic for today. If we could pull up the pictures we have. So we'll maybe if we could go actually to like the third or the fourth image. There's like a just like a weird picture in one of those slides. It's yeah, number 4, I think. Yes, I think this is maybe a good place to start. So
I was
John,
going to start with just kind of at the beginning with the manufacturing process.
yeah, well, I think let's start at the very beginning, right, John? So the IRGC got hacked by an Iranian hacker group, right? Would you say that's the beginning?
We don't know who actually got hacked. So there is a cyber threat group, the Prana Network. I've never heard of them. I have no idea who they're affiliated with. A lot of these groups are affiliated with state intelligence services of various countries. I've never heard of the Prana group. I have no idea if they're totally independent, if they're affiliated with a specific national government, sponsored by them. No idea. I have no idea who any of these people are. It isn't exactly clear who they hacked, if it was the IRGC or the Russians. It appears to be the Russians, given that most of the material is in Russian. There is some Farsi there as well as some English, but most of the material appears to be Russian. So I would assume they probably hacked Alabuga, which is the manufacturer or the manufacturer of Russian localized Shaheds in Russia, rather than having hacked Hessa, which is the original Iranian manufacturer of the system.
Got it. That doesn't actually make more sense because, as you said, so the documents are like available online. They were leaked, right, by this group
Correct.
who
Yes,
we kind of don't know.
it was about 45 files, about 430 megabytes or so, and then 6.8 gigabytes of emails. I've gone through the files. I haven't fully translated all of them, but I've gone through all the files. I've gone through a couple dozen of the emails. I kind of stopped because there were like several hundred to maybe 1,000, 2,000 of them. And the couple dozen I read, they didn't really have any particularly useful information as far as I can tell. It looked to be mostly logistical stuff regarding China, Iran, and kind of just, we're going to ship 1,000 barrels of oil from point A to point B. It didn't appear to be immediately relevant. So I'm sure hopefully somebody goes through them in depth and sees if there's anything else interesting in there, but I didn't find anything additionally useful in there just at a glance.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, but yeah, they appear very authentic, I would say, based on my own experience with them. I mean, would you agree, John?
Yeah, they mostly, again, I don't want to stray into confirmation bias here, but They appear to be mostly consistent with other published information about the Shaheds. I had pinged some Ukrainian contacts about this, and they said that they appeared, well, they couldn't vouch for specific documentation. They said that the overall, the broad picture painted by these documents is correct as far as they're aware.
Yeah, like obviously we can't speak to every individual piece of information in the documents, but broadly speaking, it's a lot of documents. There's a lot of information there. There's blueprints to factories, and lots of in-depth photographic information of the manufacturing process. It would be quite an elaborate ruse to like fake all of it. But so yeah, just to speak to the veracity a little bit. So it outlines an arrangement, obviously, between some Russian companies and some Iranian companies about the manufacturing of Shahed drones, right, John? So we could maybe talk about the parameters of the arrangement or what we learned.
Right. So let's kind of start with the overall terms of the deal, then we can kind of go into the manufacturing aspect of it. That probably works a little bit better. So if you'll pull up the 4 images that I sent, the last one of which is in English, that would be a good place to start with the overall parameters of the sale from Iran to Russia.
So, John, I don't know if we have all this stuff. I don't know if I got that up in time. But if you
Okay.
go ahead and talk about it.
Right. So the overall parameters of this deal is that Iran would sell Russia um, obviously Shaheds themselves, Shahed 131s and Shahed 136s directly, but they would also sell them the technology, equipment, source code, as well as provide training for Russia to manufacture them domestically. The total arrangement was for 6,000 Shahed vehicles. It doesn't differentiate between 131 and 136. The initial batches of those were provided directly from Iran. They were manufactured in Iran, with the rest on balance to be manufactured in Russia at the Alabuga plant in Tatarstan. So the total value of the deal is roughly 108 billion rubles, which works out to approximately $1.75 billion at the current exchange rate. This is extremely expensive, to put it mildly, not least because Russia is apparently paying the Iranian government in gold bullion presumably, because the Iranian government will not accept rubles for rather obvious reasons. And I'm assuming Russia, for whatever reason, does not want to touch their US dollar denominated Forex reserves. So Russia's literally paying for Shaheds in solid gold. Um, the On top of this, it looks like Russia invested about 48 billion rubles in the actual plant itself in Russia in Alabuga. They spent about 36 billion outfitting the plants, plus 12 billion rubles actually building the facilities and the complex itself. And then the cost of the 6,000 Shaheds, not just the unit cost, but this includes, I believe, the training, some of the software, and other items, worked out to about 72 billion rubles. The actual per unit cost itself, for the order that they placed for those that were, again, coming directly from Iran, that were manufactured by HESA in Iran, worked out to about $193,000 per unit, so 12 million rubles, again, at the current exchange rate. The initial discussion was that Iran would provide them at 23 million rubles, or $375,000 per unit. In the course of the negotiations between Iran and Russia, the number of Shaheds included in the program was increased to 6,000, and that brought the unit price down initially to 18 million rubles, or $290,000 for 2,000 Shaheds, and then finally to the final number, which was again $193,000 for each for 6,000 Shaheds. And
So,
this is so I well, sorry, go ahead, Joseph.
oh no, no, please go ahead.
So what I was going to say is that, for those who aren't familiar with how these things are priced, it's non-trivial to break down what's actually included in that unit price. A lot of people are saying it's all markup, it's all profit margin for the Iranians. That's probably not the case, but a lot of it's profit margin. This is enormously expensive for Russia. This is shockingly expensive, actually. This The cost for the initial lots of these that Russia was paying exceeded public estimates by about an order of magnitude, by a factor of 10. So this wildly exceeded my own estimates for how much they cost, and my estimates were already kind of on the high end for public estimates for the unit cost of a Shahed. The flip side of this, though, is that, and again, I put a slide up of it. I'm not sure if you can put it up on screen. It's the one with the graph of the number breakdown towards the end. The actual production cost for Russia, once localized, or rather the projected unit cost for localization in Russia, assuming no supply chain disruptions, works out to about 4.4 million rubles per unit, or about 48, well, let's say $50,000, call it even, for each Shahed. That's on the high end. Again, compared to the public estimates, I want to say the estimates from some Middle Eastern sources when it was first deployed, and even the Shaheds that were deployed in the Middle East before the invasion of Ukraine began, they were estimating roughly $20,000 to $30,000 per unit. Again, those produced locally in Russia worked out to about double that, which was a little bit around what I was expecting personally. About $50,000, which is not really great for the capability that you get. It's cheaper than a large number of surface-to-air missiles. I mean, it's cheaper than a Stinger, for example, which costs about $100,000 a unit. It's cheaper than AIM-9X Sidewinder, which costs about $400,000. But at the same time, we have, they're in the West anyways, in the United States specifically, we do have things like APKWS, Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System, that cost about $25,000 per unit. And again, even Stinger, given how many we can manufacture at scale and just given the size of our economy or other Western economies, even though it costs double that of a Shahed, we can still just produce a lot of them, and the cost ratio kind of just doesn't matter at that point. So the exchange cost the overall conclusion to take away from this is that the cost exchange ratio for Russia employing the Shaheds is much less favorable than many people on the internet and in other defense communities were thinking it would be. This is it's I would say it's a barely positive exchange for Russia that can easily get drowned out by other factors such as just raw production capacity of countermeasures.
Wonderful, John. I think that answered all the questions I had about the arrangement itself. Is there anything else about the arrangement that you wanted to point out?
So we don't know how much Russia has actually paid Iran as of yet. There is a press statement that's in half an well. There's a what looks like honestly a bank statement. There's a record of a financial transaction, half in Russian, half in Farsi, that references the use of gold bullion. Isn't the full 1.75 billion? It looks like just an individual payment, but that's what we're taking as evidence that it is being paid in gold bullion. The fact that we have evidence of an individual payment made in gold, and that's what I'd say about the overall agreement. Which kind of transition us to our next the next aspect of this, which is that this encompasses more than just the Shahed 136 that we're familiar with. So how it started out is that Iran
So
offered the
real quick, John, I knew, so we had so many documents, and I was like, I couldn't come up with a good system to like have the documents on hand that we needed specifically because they're all in Russian, But so for the manufacturing process, I made sure we have the whole PDF, all 200 pages of it, John. So if you ever want a page of that, please just let us know, and we'll bring it up. But if you could bring up the manufacturing production PDF, appreciate it. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
right. So how this started out is that Iran offered the Shahed platform, so to speak, as a product to Russia. So Russia has adopted the Shahed 136 for all practical purposes. However, they weren't initially offered just the 136. They were offered the 136 and the 131, the 131 being more or less the overall characteristics are similar, except that it's smaller and somewhat shorter range. Um, we haven't seen Shahed 131s in probably a year. Russia deployed them as the Jiran 1 with the 136 being the Jiran 2. Russia deployed them both initially, and then we stopped seeing the Jiran 1 after a little while. And these documents actually internally reflect that, as they reference Russia after having employed both of them in Ukraine. they reached the decision that to standardize on the 136, that the 131 was not something they were interested in. So that 6,000 units of just Shaheds became 6,000 Shahed 136s. And there's also references to other Shahed products, including Shahed 136 derivatives, um, like the 236 and then the 237 and the 238. I'll get to that in a little bit. But we should probably go over the manufacturing process just a little bit to give people a sense of what's actually going on here and why these leaks are so interesting. So, I mean, feel free to pull up any page of the PDF. Doesn't really matter.
Yes, I'm talking to the back end people as we speak, John. Please begin your discussion of the manufacturing process. Thank you.
Yes. So what this PDF depicts is the composite layup process for the Shahed airframe. It doesn't. There's other parts of the manufacturing process. The PDF is not a complete description. It's just the production of the airframe itself. So what we can see is them the geometry of the molds they're using and the process through which they're putting down those composite layers in the mold, binding them together with epoxy, doing the vacuum bagging and sealing to cure the epoxy, and then how the actual buildup of the airframe structure itself. That's really what we're seeing here. And so there's some very good images of it. We can see the process through which they're mixing the chemicals, they're preparing the epoxy, the binders, through which they're cutting and trimming uh, the carbon layers, laying down the aviation plywood, designing the fins, actually the curing process. The PDF is rather comprehensive. We have broad dimensions for a lot of the airframe. And then towards the end, we can see the process through which they install the aramid fiber, which is essentially a type of synthetic fiber. Think of like Kevlar, for example. It's an aramid fiber. The process through which they install that aramid fiber, essentially structural cage inside the airframe, it's a rather comprehensive. I've shared this with a bunch of friends who work in various fields of engineering, and they're all very, very delighted to see this. It's an incredible amount of insight into how the Russians approach the process. One thing to note about it is that in general, doing composite layups is very labor intensive for non-regular geometries. And by non-regular, I mean things that essentially they're not spherical, they're not cylindrical, they're not, cubic, for example. So anything that's not a regular geometric solid, it's very difficult to automate that process. It can be done. There's ways to do it to reduce the amount of man labor that has to go into it. Um, you know, you can do things like premix binders and other curing agents, and then refrigerate them. You can pre-impregnate parts with those binders and agents, and then refrigerate them. All of those things add complexity and cost, and it looks like the Russians more or less directly copied the Iranian manufacturing method, which is again to just do all of this by hand. And so,
Yeah,
yeah, as you can see, they're applying the binder, the epoxies. They're cutting all these little pieces by hand, using the little bags, etc.
yeah. I think it speaks to a I don't know, like a pretty thoroughly documented process, but a fairly primitive manufacturing process. Would you agree,
Yes, I
John,
mean,
or what do you think?
I would say, well, it's primitive, but this is the industry standard, I would say, for this type of composite layup that you aren't doing at an enormous scale. There are ways to automate it when you're, again, dealing with non regular geometries, as you are here with this type of airframe. But the equipment that you need for that is very, very expensive. And it's probably difficult for Russia to get their hands on some of it given the sanctions regime. And there's one of the things that's also described in the avionics, or excuse me, the avionics I'm talking about, the documents, is the actual Iranian manufacturing process and how they've structured it industrially. And it seems pretty clear that they went for this process because it's simple, because they don't have, because they don't need to import all this machine tooling to do it. They can do it locally with just labor. and they can source 90% of the components locally in Iran, the remaining 10% presumably being mostly microelectronics, as well as I would suspect those aramid fibers, which Russia themselves are sourcing from China. And the Russians themselves have been able to localize all of the airframe components except for those aramid fibers that are used for that internal structural cage, if you will. So yeah, again, this is a process that's designed for simplicity, and Russia probably doesn't have easy access to the means to automate it. At the same time, if you have a very large available labor pool, then this is something that you can get away with. It's not efficient, but if you have people to just throw out the problem, it's not particularly skilled labor. Obviously, the people that are doing this are going to require some level of training, but this isn't something you need, particularly skilled engineers or technicians to run the line on a daily basis.
Whose mic is that? Is that yours, John?
That's not mine.
Can we mute whoever that is? Okay, so John, yeah, thank you for the discussion of the manufacturing process. I guess maybe the one question I have is like, is there an ability to scale up here for the Russians, right? I mean, you already mentioned the cost is kind of astronomical because A, Iran's fleecing them left and right, and B, I think you kind of laid out, like, they're not really producing these things in like a modern, like, industrial way. They kind of require some finessing here to get what they need done.
So in terms of scaling, so the current target for the plant, and I have this documented somewhere. The projected target for the manufacturing capacity at the Alabuga plant was about 220 units a month in terms of Shahed production. That works out to about 2,600 annually. So that's their current target. They're likely have met that, so they're likely producing, I'd say, 200 to 250 of these of the Shaheds a month. One interesting thing about the deal, though, is that I'm not sure if you can pull up the picture of the translated version I sent earlier. Um, that was the target by 2024, 2025. Again, about 2,600 annually. The Russians, though, per the terms of this agreement, plan to go beyond the original 6,000 and scale to produce 10,000 per year locally on, presumably on a 2026, 2027, 2028 timescale.
Got it. And I don't know, you think that's basically feasible with the
That's definitely feasible. I mean, the Shahed is a very simple design fundamentally. The cost exchange ratio isn't great for it just because of a variety of different factors related to, cheap threats have cheap countermeasures. That axiom is almost invariably true. But at the end of the day, it's still something that's fairly inexpensive and easy for Russia to manufacture. What's, I guess, of more interest is the Shahed derivatives, specifically the 236 series and the 237/238 series. So, and this is where we get to the really, really funny part in terms of costs. So, the 236, the designations here are a bit muddy. The documents refer to them as the M236 and the MS236, and they appear to be identical to the baseline Shahed 136 in every way except for two important ways. So again, I put images in the chat. If you can find a way to get those up, that would be appreciated to give people a better sense of what we're talking about. It would be the second set of images that I sent. The MS236 is essentially just a Shahed 136 with a terminal seeker and a data link added to it. It looks like an optical infrared seeker with a data link that allows an operator to control it in flight. And it has a line of sight data link, so that limits its range based upon terrain and the curvature of the Earth. So the MS236 is to be paired with a M236, which is just a baseline Shahed 136 modified to have a relay system on board. So the MS236 would transmit its data link that allows it to connect with the operator to the M236, and then the M236 would then relay it back to the ground station. And so that gives them an overall range of about 220 kilometers for use of that complex together. So that would be for the use against tactical targets like vehicles, air defense systems. This would essentially be transforming the Shahed platform from a one-way attack UAV, to use the term of art, which is a funny way of saying a cheap bootleg cruise missile, to an actual true loitering munition for use in tactical operational context. And what's particularly funny here about this is the cost. So they were looking to order ones manufactured in Iran, and they were looking to order specifically 2,000 of the 236 Seeker versions, and then an undisclosed number of the corresponding relay versions. But the unit cost for the Seeker version is $900,000, which is unbelievable. To give context for some people, an AGM 158 joint air to surface standoff munition, which is a very low observable air launched cruise missile, the standard used by the United States, costs $900,000. So for a Shahed, a $50,000 UAV with a terminal seeker, they are paying as much as the United States does for 1,000-kilometer range, very low observable cruise missile. And on top of that, that's more expensive than Caliber or KH-101. So for whatever reason, Russia has made the decision to buy 2,000 Shaheds, 2,000 Seeker equipped Shaheds at a cost greater than their own cruise missile systems, which is bizarre. I It's hysterical because they should not cost. Well, it's hysterical for two reasons. A, these should not cost $900,000. Obviously, not all of that is markup. Some of that will no doubt go into actually supporting the Iranian production line, but a very large percentage of that is markup. It's margin, profit margin for the Iranian government. And really, no matter how generous you are in terms of what percentage of that's going back into the Iranian manufacturing line, the Iranians are absolutely robbing the Russians blind. This is an insane price. This is I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is the most ridiculous price arrangement I've ever seen in a defense contract, like published in the past 2 decades. It's absurd. It's genuinely absurd. And then on top of that, there is a further evolution of the Shahed, variously known as the Shahed 237 or the 238. In these documents, it's references the 237. In the public exhibitions that Iran has done, it's references the 238. My hypothesis is that the distinction between them is a seeker. So essentially, what fundamentally the 237 and the 238 are is they're a Shahed airframe with turbojet propulsion, replacing the piston engine propeller propulsion on the baseline Shahed. So that cuts your range in half from about 2,000 to 1,000 kilometers, but it takes your cruising speed up from about 150 kilometers per hour to about 600, so more comparable to an actual cruise missile. Um, my hypothesis is that 237 references the version without a seeker, and 238 is the version with a seeker. The latter is what has been advertised by Iran. The former is what's referenced in these documents as what Russia's interested in procuring. And they make reference to Russia planning to buy 677 Shahed 237s for a unit price of $1.4 million, which, again, I stress is they're getting a bootleg cruise missile at a cost greater than, a comparable to the standard U.S. cruise missile, and that's probably 150 to 175% the cost of their own Caliber and KH-101. It defies belief that they have decided to move forward with this arrangement. My working theory is that the Russians want speed. The Russians want these delivered soon, and that they're willing to pay Iran to pay Iran's absurd pricing because they are unable to scale their own domestic cruise missile production in the time frame that they want to. My guess would be that they're probably having issues with their own domestic turbojet production, the TRD D50 for KH-101 and Caliber, as well as the Skander K. And they don't think that they can resolve those problems in the time frame that they want to. So they're willing to pay Iran truly gratuitous sums of money to get the Shaheds because Iran can deliver them and they can stand up production of the Shaheds locally, as well as again import the enhanced Shaheds, if you will, from Iran directly on a shorter time frame that's more in line with the Russians want. And again, just kind of put the total program costs into perspective here. $1.75 billion. If you go back and look at some of the program history here from the US side of things and adjust for inflation, all of that, that's again almost as much as it costs us to develop JASSM. So again, Iran is buying kind of not fantastic UAVs for the same price it costs the United States to develop what's arguably the world's most sophisticated air launch cruise missile currently in service. Um, it's just such a this entire deal is such a bizarre expression of military industrial policy in a wartime environment that I'm honestly not quite sure how to approach it. It's just so strange on so many levels.
It is, John. Now we're running a little low on time here, and we got another section to get through here. So thank you for the discussion of the manufacturing. I think the point is clear, right, on both the arrangement itself and the manufacturing process. That yeah, Russia's getting gouged, which is good news. Everything we've presented so far has been fairly straightforward and logical, but this wouldn't be a story about Russia without something depressing and strange and you know, cringe.
Yeah.
So now we get to that part. So if we could close this document and go back to the PowerPoint, please, Mr. Technical Man. Thank you very much for our technical people helping present many technical things. Okay, so if we go to the first slide, thank you. So this shows who's actually building the drones, John, and it's somehow. I mean, so one thing I should mention: a lot of this came out in the Russian press. Certain journalists were leaking information about this in Russian language press for a while. But this document basically confirms that stuff. So I don't want to pretend that this is completely new information, but it's still absolutely horrifying, and it is confirmed. So we're sharing it. John, if you want to talk about who's actually making this stuff, go ahead.
Right. So the plan. Keep in mind these documents. We don't know the exact date, but they're likely. This specific presentation is likely from sometime early 2023. So the composition, the staffing of the plant has probably changed. It's probably grown in size. It's almost certainly grown in size since then. But what this slide provides us with is a breakdown of the number of employees for different teams, essentially, and the number of employees needed, and sort of what their background is. And so, what's interesting about this is that my understanding, both the machine translation, I also got the help of a couple of native Russian speakers to help me translate and interpret this. Is as of the date of this document, which again, roughly estimating is probably mid to early 2023, there are 286 people employed at this plant. And what's interesting and disturbing about this is that it references 175 of them being college students. So, cross referencing this with other local Russian media reports from essentially since summer of last year, we know this refers to Alabuga Polytechnical College, which is sort of a local Russian college near where this plant is located in Tatarstan. And what's interesting is you have to understand how the Russian schooling system works. And the key aspect of it is that college in Russia refers to really a younger age group than, say, what would be familiar with here in the United States or in Europe. And it really refers to, at the lower end, 15 to 16-year-olds and 17 to 18-year-olds on the higher end. And so, in other words, what it looks like has occurred is that essentially a bunch of these local college students, quote unquote, again, mostly 15 to 16-year-olds, some 17 to 18-year-olds, have been given semi-voluntary internships to work at this plant. And this isn't explicitly referenced in the documents, but the way it was explained to me by a couple Ukrainian friends, how the Soviet Russian schooling system works is that these internships are considered semi-voluntary. The anecdote I was given was they're considered semi-voluntary in the same way that taking an exam is semi-voluntary. You can technically refuse, but it's gonna jack you up. And there's usually also financial penalties that are associated with dropping out if you also decline one of these internships, on the order of like 100 to 200,000 rubles. So more or less, these college students, they have been told to go work at the plant, and if they refuse, they will basically be kicked out of school and financially penalized in one of Russia's poorest regions. I might add, 100 to 200,000 rubles, which is probably more than a year's salary. Um, and on top of this, they're barely getting paid to work there. So I'm not sure if you have the actual pay scale slide up. That would be very helpful, because it's kind of complex. Let's see if we can get that up.
Yeah, slide number 2, please. That
So
one.
how they've divided this pay scale, and this is the second gross part of all of this, besides the de facto child labor, is they're being given a base salary of 3,000 rubles a month. I'm not going to bother with the USD conversions because cost of living in Russia is much less. I don't actually know the cost of living in Tatarstan off the top of my head, but this probably is insufficient, to put it mildly. So the base pay is 3,000 rubles, and then essentially what it looks like is that employees, the interns, the quote unquote interns, and then the non interns are essentially forced to compete against each other, and the most productive are given pay bonuses according to this, I guess, pay scale. The categories are wood, bronze, silver, and gold. Wood gets no pay bonus. Bronze gets a 4,000 ruble a month pay bonus for non-interns, and a 2,000 ruble a month bonus for quote unquote interns. Silver is a 13,000 ruble bonus for non-interns, and a 6,500 ruble bonus for quote unquote interns. And finally, gold is a 35,000 ruble monthly bonus, and then 9,000 ruble bonus for the, again, quote unquote interns. That's not a lot, again, to live on in this region. And moreover, I would note that 25% of the students, well, they're getting no bonus because they're in the wood category. So they get 3,000 rubles a month to live on, which is very questionable. And then another 50% that are in the bronze category get 5,000 rubles a month, including the bonus, that makes about 75% of them. So more or less, we're at the stage where a majority, 60% of the workforce at the Shahed plant, as of whenever this document was created, again, mid to early 2023, is being produced by de facto child labor, 60% of the people there. And then on top of that, we can go back to the previous slide. You'll notice a reference to Tajiks and mulattoes. It took me a while to figure out what this is, but in consultation again with some friends who are native Russian speakers, it looks like Tajik refers to Central Asian migrant laborers, and mulattoes to African migrant laborers. And given sort of the nature of how migrant labor works in Russia, there's a very significant probability that not should say most of them, that a fair number of them were either trafficked or lured to work in Russia under false premises or pretenses. And they make up about 25% of the workforce. So again, we have the Shaheds, the workforce that manufactures the Shaheds is 60% underage students who are more or less being forced to work there, and then it's 25% migrant workers, which is very off-putting, to put it mildly.
And I just want to get meth chemists out of the way. I'm a little disappointed no one in chat brought this up. It's a mistranslation. We assume it's metallurgist, right, John?
Yeah, metallurgists, or that was the. I talked to two native speaker friends. They couldn't quite agree on what it meant, but they thought it meant either like material chemists or metallurgists or metallurgy chemists or something to that effect.
Yeah, some kind of expert on probably the material that it's made from, right? The plastic stuff.
Yes. These would be the actual some of the senior engineers running the plant.
Yeah, so I think like the in conclusion, to the horrifying part of this is it's, as you said, they're being produced by what, 60% child labor of questionable. Like, I had some rough student jobs and I've heard of some rough internships, but gee whiz. And then the other what, 30% is human
20%.
trafficking.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, so it's
So uniquely Russian.
yeah, uniquely Russian endeavor to produce these things. And I don't know, John. I mean, is there anything else we wanted people to take away from this aside from being disgusted and horrified by Russia's continuing efforts to terrorize the Ukrainian population and somehow finding ways to find new bottoms to do so?
I don't think there's any other takeaways at this time. This is, I mean, it's a pretty comprehensive set of information. A couple of friends of mine are working on like a full cost analysis based upon this. I don't think they've published it yet, but I will quote tweet or retweet that on my timeline whenever my friend who's an engineer finishes his analysis on this.
Yeah, thanks, John. If you do you have any other like concluding thoughts on this topic? I think we're basically wrapping up here.
No, I don't believe so. Again, the materials are available online. I have a link to the original, like the repository released by the hackers that has all the original material. That's the original release, the link they released it on. I don't know if there's any. I guess I downloaded it safely without issue. A bunch of my friends downloaded it safely without any apparent issues, but I would not want to distribute that link publicly. Just out of caution and not wanting to have random people on the internet, interface with very questionable links from cyber threat actors. Um, so I'm not sure if there's any safe link currently available or any safe upload of these publicly online. People can access if they want to go look at them themselves. If I find anything like that somebody else has uploaded on like Cloudflare or something, I'll post that on my timeline.
Wonderful, thank you, John. So yeah, that's the Shahed leaks, everyone. Very interesting stuff. I want to thank John and all the people who were helping him out and involved, I should say, in the collaborative effort to translate and kind of understand the context that the documents came out of. Very interesting stuff and equally horrifying. So thanks for John. Jonathan, I think we're about ready to wrap up. I guess real quick, though, we wanted to maybe talk about just a little bit of good news about our feature in The Economist. Daniela, real quick, I mean, did you just want to talk about, I know, so for people who don't know, we had Daniela's work at Tochnyi, which is fantastic. He logs all the drone strikes that Angel Perpetua is collecting and sort of aggregates that information and displays the information, the aggregated information, so we can draw analysis from it, right? And so The Economist approached Daniela about featuring that information in an article they did, and it was published last week. So, Danielle, did you have to say about that before we wrap up?
Now, hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you now, buddy.
Yeah, sorry. I just updated the Mac OS and it changed all my setting. Anyway, yeah, it was a very nice interaction, and they have been very professional. I transmitted all the data and all the analysis that I have done, and they integrated it beautifully in the paper that they published, in the article that they published, which essentially included a lot of other contribution. To be honest, it's not only us, but most of the data, if not all the data that about the strikes, is from the work that I've done with the data collected by Geek and Andrew. So yeah, it was a very nice use of all those detailed information that we often publish. So is I'm very happy that this happened. And furthermore, in the next few days, I'm going to continue to work on this data. I published just a few days ago an update. If you go on my profile, I think it's one of my last thread about the FPV usage. and there you can find the latest figure. I don't know if you want to go over them, or we can just discuss these in another time, maybe, because it's too late. It's very late today. Up to you.
I think it's a little late today, but maybe
Yeah.
next week could we do it?
Yeah, of course.
Cool. Beautiful. Okay, so yeah, I think we're gonna wrap up here, but yeah, really congratulations, Daniela, for getting the research from Tochnyi, I should say, featured in The Economist. It's really fantastic news. As I've often mentioned, like the whole goal of Tochnyi, and when we started, we see like a lot of like bad information or misinformation or just kind of like amateur, takes on Ukraine a lot, and we're doing our best to try to sort through all that noise for people and bring them accurate information, and then they can do with it what they want, right? And so to have just kind of the raw data about the strikes published in The Economist, where I think a lot of people that wouldn't otherwise read our work is going to read it, and to have them take that information and kind of do something with it, that's really like what it's all about for me. So really congratulations, Daniela, and I'm really proud of the whole team for keeping everything working at Tochnyi so that such things are possible. And great interview today from Jonathan as well. So Jonathan, I think we're wrapping up, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, buddy. Unless I think you have picture of the week, and if you want to do the outro, I can. Go ahead.
Thanks, Joseph. We've got our picture of the week. It is taken from Ben Goldhagen's remarkable film. And so thank you, everyone, for joining us. Andrew Perpetua's stream is starting about now. We thoroughly recommend it. Please do check out the Economist article, as Joseph and Daniela just noted. Perseverance is that secret of all triumphs, embodied in the Ukrainian achievements we witness and conveyed, I think, through Ben Goldhagen's film that we saw today. Ukrainians persevere as we approach the second anniversary of this devastating full-scale invasion of their country that has changed so many lives. Thank you for joining Tochnyi once again. Please check in again next week. We will be here. Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava.
Heroyam Slava.
On behalf of the brave.